Thank you, John. And thank you all for joining us for the closing program for the exhibition, John Hitchcock, Bury the Hatchet at the Portland Art Museum. My name is Kathleen Ash-Milby, and I am the museum's curator of Native American art. I am a member of the Navajo Nation, and I'm new to this territory, which I recognize as the ancestral homelands of the Willamette, Tumwater, Clackamas, Cathlamet, Molalla, Multnomah, and Watlala Chinook peoples, the Tualatin Kalapuya, who are today part of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, and many other Native communities who made their homes along the Columbia River. I'm sitting in a living room with a bookcase in the background, wearing a dark pink sweater. I have gray glasses and gray messy hair. Bury the Hatchet was first organized at the Missoula Art Museum in 2019. It opened at the Portland Art Museum on March 7th, 2020. We were thrilled and lucky, it turns out, to host John Hitchcock in person here in Portland for the opening of his exhibition. He gave a wonderful presentation to members of our Native American Art Council, and we had a wonderful reception. Who knew it would be the last public event many of us would attend for over a year? As you know, the world turned upside down pretty quickly. After many months, the exhibition reopened in the fall for a very few short weeks before we closed again due to the pandemic. Unfortunately, the exhibition is moving on to its next venue, but you can see our installation through a virtual tour on our website. And I'm very pleased to be introducing our panel today for the closing program, Oklahome. I'll keep my intros brief, so please check our website for their full bios. They're really interesting. Nancy Marie Mithlo will be moderating the discussion today. She is a Chiricahua Apache and a professor of gender studies and affiliated faculty with the American Indian Studies Interdepartmental Program at the University of California, Los Angeles. Mithlo's curatorial work has resulted in 9 exhibitions at the Venice Biennale. Her 2020 book, Knowing Native Arts, is published by the University of Nebraska Press. Dustin Tahmahkera is a citizen of the Comanche Nation of Oklahoma. He is an interdisciplinary scholar of North American indigeneities, critical media, and sound. His forthcoming book, Cinematic Comanches, Representing in the Media Borderlands, will be published this fall by the University of Nebraska Press. Cinematic Comanches is a cultural history of real Comanches' performative work on screen and off in the production of what he calls Comancheria cinema. Christopher Aplin is an ethnomusicologist and is a recorded sound collection grant writer who helps build sustainable digital collections that reinforce tribal community library, language, and history programs. He's also writing a book about the music of the Apache prisoners of war seized with Geronimo in 1886. And we would not be here today if it weren't for the Comanche artist John Hitchcock. Raised on Comanche tribal lands in the Wichita Mountains, Oklahoma, near Medicine Park and U.S. Army Fort Sill, Hitchcock is an artist, professor of art, and associate dean of the arts at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's also a musician. He conceived of this multidisciplinary installation while working as an artist in residence at the Buffalo Bill Center of the West in Cody, Wyoming in 2017. I first met John at the American Indian Community House Gallery in New York City over 15 years ago when I organized a solo exhibition of his work. It has been a pleasure to follow your career, John, and to turn to you for the first exhibition I presented at the Portland Art Museum in our Center for Contemporary Native Art. Thank you for your thoughtful, beautiful work. And with that, I will hand the screen over to Nancy.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. It's an honor to be here. And I want to first thank the Portland Art Museum and your sponsors, everyone who's made today possible. For the audience out there, this is a gang of folks who have home ties in Oklahoma, and we have really been looking forward to this moment. I'm speaking to you from Los Angeles, which is the homelands of the Gabrielino and the Tongva peoples. I've got brown hair, a navy jacket, and a print in the background. I'm thrilled to be here today introducing John and his work. We've known each other for some time. We taught together in Wisconsin, University of Wisconsin-Madison for how long, John? 7 years, maybe? And then we took some exhibits overseas to Venice together in 2011 and in 2013. And I'm always just so inspired by what you put together, and it's always ambitious and creative and unexpected. So I'm not going to spend any more time here. I just want to say again, thank you to the Portland Art Museum. And John, share with us this PowerPoint that you've got.
Yeah, thank you, Nancy. I want to thank Kathleen Ash-Milby and the museum and everyone for coming out, and a big oraho to Nancy and Dustin Tahmahkera and Chris Aplin, and we all go back in different ways, and so I'm excited to have a conversation with them. Before we go into that, I'm going to do a little share in the screen, and let's make sure we're situated here. And let me get the full deal. And yes, thank everyone. I'm going to start with this short video real quick. This little place in Oklahoma here, and I'm going to start with this video, Generation to Generation.
Story that was told by old man Toheen back in summer of 1926, which is where the Indian Hospital is now. He was a patient, and he was always there, you know. And him and old man Joshua, Ned Timber's father-in-law, they seem like everyone knows them both.
So generation to generation is my grandfather telling a story, and the music is The Stolen Sea, which I'll talk about more here in a moment. So the majority of my work is revolving around where I grew up. I grew up on Comanche tribal lands located among the Wichita Mountains of Oklahoma, and they're also known as a wildlife reserve for deer and longhorn. A huge component of my upbringing as a kid, I learned how to draw from my grandmother. And she asked me to design patterns and for her beadwork and shapes. And from that, I really learned a lot about observational drawing, design, and thinking, imaginative thinking. So this was a huge moment for me of understanding and learning, kind of the same things I worked through in teaching.
He said they'd go on a hunting party and they showed the boys how to kill buffalo and then how they would dress them. And that old man Tahmahkera said that they'd never waste nothing. They would bring everything back and they would utilize everything.
On the days leading up to his passing, several owls were hovering over the house, and one landed on the roof. At that time, we knew. Me, my brother, sister, and cousins all left the house to give our Comanche grandmother time alone with him. Grandfather passed away in her arms as she sang traditional songs to him.
What do we got? That's my song, John. You must learn it.
So that is Gaku's song, is this short video. It's my grandfather telling a story at the beginning, and then I tell a story of him passing away, and then also there's images of drawings and my grandmother's beadwork that's on there. This is Birds, Beads, and Bombs. So in contrast to the Wichita Mountains and the land in that area, the United States military base Fort Sill, Lawton, is located. It's one of the largest field artillery training bases in the United States. Historically, this area, the post was established as a 19th century Indian Wars fort, and it served as a camp of imprisonment for many indigenous leaders such as Geronimo of the Apache people, St. Thide of the Kiowa, and Quanah Parker of the Comanche people. These are some works that are influenced by my grandmother's beadwork. On the left, you've got You Belong Here, and on the right is Those Who Tell the Truth Shall Die, and Those Who Tell the Truth Shall Live Forever. So this is all recent work that was created during COVID, the COVID times, and it's in my makeshift basement studio, which you see behind me here. That's where I've been creating a lot of this, and actually screen printing in the summer outside when it's warm. So again, this work is very much influenced by my grandmother's beadwork. This one's actually called, She Scattered Her Beads on the Table. Also, I lost my vision recently this summer, and I had 2 strokes, so that had an impact, which shifted me quite a bit in thinking. Also shifted the work from a less political, still there's a political edge in the thinking, but it's more visual that started to happen in exploring the visuals. This is the Bury the Hatchet project that started at the Portland, it's currently at the Portland Art Museum, but It started at the Missoula Art Museum, and this is the album that was produced. And I'm in the Bury the Hatchet, I'm thinking about the land, language, and the visual symbols of the Great Plains. This area, the Wichita Mountains, I feel like is the epicenter for Plains tribal culture. To me, the relationship between Fort Sill, Wichita Mountains Reserve, and the tribal lands is the key to the thinking process that I'm thinking about when making. This is the Stolen Sea here, the band that I've worked with to create the album. Nate Mang on the left there, Allison Lenz on cello, and Hannah Edlin. I also want to give out a shout out to Ryan Lansing, who helped produce this album and is also now a member of the Stolen Sea. So much of this was the first time I brought together printmaking, installation, performance art, and the music. I've been playing music for many years, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And so Bury the Hatchet explores a lot of the political and personal issues that I've experienced, and they really relate to assimilation, acculturation, and indoctrination, and how that functions within my thinking patterns. But I'm gonna actually stop talking slides and turn it over to Nancy, and then we'll go from there. Shall I stop sharing? Here we go.
You know, yeah, John, that's so tender. And I just want to say, every time I see you present, I'm really moved. And I saw when you gave that virtual walkthrough that's on the Portland Art Museum website, how you talked about cultural responsibility to land and to people. And just now in that little tape where I think it was your grandma's voice saying, John, you must learn it.
You must learn that song.
Yeah. And I think that infuses everything you do. And so I don't know if you just want to maybe talk about that. And then I want to switch actually back to the PowerPoint, because I think Dustin had a question about the beads, birds, and bombs image.
A long time ago, I remember Grandma, when I was in grad school, she would always say, "You're always honoring me. You're always honoring me. I thank you for doing that." And I think back to as a little kid sitting at the table when she scattered her beads on the table, and I'm learning how to draw, that just all the lessons that she would teach, and also my grandfather. And I think that was just it's sitting around, like even with you, Nancy, when we've been at gatherings, you're around a fire and there's all these women that are there. Like I didn't know like who my mom was, because everybody was my mom, my aunt, my cousins, all of us, you know, the women looked out for you. And so I think that notion of learning and sitting around a big pot of things cooking outside around the fire is just important, and it kind of makes you think differently. And it's very unique to think about when I'm at these situations here in Madison, and I'm so far removed from that, but on the other end, it's just about the unity of community and how do we give back and give to each other and help each other out somehow.
Yeah, and it's so multidimensional and embodied. I mean, and so now this work to me feels very cumulative. Having watched your work over some decades now, it seems like you're really pulling things together in this very potent way. I don't know if it feels that way to you.
Yes, it's finally like the things that I've always wanted to do and imagined doing, and like making crazy installations in my room, which were just crayon marks on the wall and tapestries of rock bands, and then actually formulating them together in some way that has a thought process to it.
Yeah. Well, I wondered, let's segue over to Dustin. And John, if you could pull up that one image that he was interested in talking about. Dustin, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Thanks, Nancy.
Yeah. And Chris, we're going to hop into you in a bit too. So hold on.
Yeah, thank you. And there's the image there. Yeah, beads, birds, and bombs. You know that, and let me back up and begin with ha Madowe and the Namatekwap in the Comanche language, ha Madowe Heitzna. Nanani Asa Dustin Tahmahkera drives them out. Tahmahkera. Nakutsukini Nwakuse Okwe. My thanks to Nancy and Kathleen, and special thanks to John, thanks to Chris, Jaleesa, everyone, and to all of you who are out there somewhere for being here. I'm coming to you from Peoria homelands in central Illinois, in Champaign-Urbana, and here in my makeshift office and upstairs bedroom in gray and black plaid shirt with a poster behind me there of the Indian 101 film that my cousin Juliana Branham made about our auntie, the Comanche elder LaDonna Harris, that I would highly recommend folks check out if you haven't seen and heard that. This particular print here, yeah, if that could just stay up while I share my words here, that'd be great. I'm a longtime fan of John's work, and this is very in particular for me, with not just for the alliterative power of its title with this series of beads, birds, and bombs, but really of just going back home and where I was born in Lawton, and growing up in that area, and just south of there across the Pia Passawana, or what a lot of people call the Red River, Wichita Falls, Texas area. The sounds of nature, the sounds of birds and of Comanche ceremony and of Fort Sill artillery testing centers, all colliding and also coexisting for generations. And part of what I so appreciate about, among many things, of John's work is just this emphasis on Oklahoma, on Comanche and Kiowa homelands, and really interrogating and calling out so many, military dimensions of how the irony that continues is how for me as a Comanche Nation citizen to even go on to certain sacred sites like Medicine Bluff, we have to stop still to this day at the Fort Sill check-in center. We have to get our picture taken and have an ID that gives us permission to go onto our homelands. Or John mentioned Quanah Parker earlier, to go onto Quanah Parker's original Star House site, to go to that dwelling, you have to get permission once again. Even so, there's these ongoing ironies that happen. But I especially want to be able to share with you as this image stays up, and asking us to really think about what it means to listen to art, to listen to visual art, and this visual and sonic juxtapositions that John continually does, and really breaks down the boundaries between those and puts them in such interesting conversation together. So I wanted to share some heartfelt words with you that I've put together briefly here about John's album and the art installation Bury the Hatchet. So as someone who's invested in the Comanche borderlands and what I call border sounds, I offer this special thanks to John for his materialized vision with Bury the Hatchet. This is an album and an art installation that takes historical and modern visualities and soundscapes of intercultural allies and aggressors, where who's who in these scenarios can really shift depending on who you ask. Hitchcock's album moves toward and beyond its namesake. To bury the hatchet in conventional understanding is to make peace. And the album's title really suggests cliche and stereotype at first glance, but at first listen, when working with this album, when working this gorgeous album of Bury the Hatchet here, it carries far more depth from John and his long list of native and non-native collaborators. From the moment that I remember first putting the needle on my little suitcase Victrola player that I carry around with me, I heard the album really challenging how listeners hear and also mishear the songs and stories of America and Kiowa and Comanche peoples and geographies. This phrase, bury the hatchet, has rhetorical cousins like smoke the peace pipe, like Gene Kelly and Fred Astaire were singing back in the 1940s, and reruns of I Love Lucy were doing their own renditions of this, where they sang lyrics about pass that peace pipe and bury that hatchet, like the Choctaws, Chickasaws, and Chippewas do. And they give shout outs to these other tribes like Chicamex and Cherokees, but one C letter tribe in particular, Comanches, don't make the cut in this very stereotype laden song. historians at the time were really too busy writing us off as these one-dimensional warriors and very hyper ultra violent warriors. We were dubbed Lords of the South Plains back in 1950s by a number of scholars. And we Comanches really were not known for physical or symbolic gestures of peace. And that would also apply to our neighbors and our relatives, the Kiowas. And so Hitchcock, what I hear is he repeatedly reroutes and expands gestures of making peace by covering and uncovering weapons of war and their relations to what becomes tribal memory and popular lore. The album, as John says in another interview, it's a conversation in healing. He says, you really never bury the hatchet. You move forward and you remember the people that are really important to you. So in effect, I hear his album as a call for healing and cultural dialogue and a response to not completely burying the hatchet. Comanches and Kiowas today, we're descendants of people subject to colonial inflicted trauma through forced removals and theft, imprisonment, English-only education, and all these other structures of colonization. But bury the hatchet is this critical creative refusal to dismiss the trauma. The album is a refusal to let historical bygones be bygones, in other words, because memory and its embodiment with Native peoples and oral tradition are not gone. The healing from historical trauma is not done. John says, you really never bury the hatchet, right? And this album transcends burial and moves into this personal and familial, tribal and intergenerational path of praxis and peace and healing. So for example, the album opens with a cellist moving rendition of taps, this very well-known ceremonial military dirge conventionally played on a bugle in remembrance of fallen American soldiers and also heard at dusk on military bases. But rather than signal the end of one's time or one's day, John's use of taps at the start redirects the song's mournful sounds to recognize fallen Kiowa brethren and to open up the album's stories. As taps plays, then there's a story by the late Jason Cutnose, who's Kiowa, he sampled in which he talks of old Kiowa leaders, Lone Wolf, Momaday, Big Tree, and American Horse. And so through this Kiowa oral storytelling lens, almost from the outset, Cutnose's recorded stories return at fuller length in subsequent tracks to talk of Osages massacring Kiowas at Cutthroat Gap, Kiowas seeing meteor showers, Lone Wolf's 1863 trip to Washington, D.C. to advocate for territorial freedom for his people, right? Cutnose even quotes Lone Wolf in this long trajectory and history of oral storytelling and of these generations. He quotes him as saying, don't hold my people to any promises because we're not going to live in one place. And like his people, Hitchcock's album really refuses to be contained. So through all these original compositions with clarinet, piano, guitar, synthesizers, and these traditional Kiowa and Comanche songs and stories from Hitchcock's own family archives, recordings, Bury the Hatchet involves over 90 lush minutes of colliding mixed soundscapes, right? That what could be heard as cacophonous to some people who can't fathom somehow in the 21st century of hearing old Native stories or powwow songs that get layered and mixed with Hitchcock's guitars, a pedal steel, lap steel, and electric. They become not a discordant mixture, but really I hear them as these swirling layers of sounds coexisting together, similar to, again, this coexisting of sounds like you can see and imagine hearing and go back home to Oklahoma and literally audibly hear the sounds and beads, birds, and bombs. So John's multifaceted, eclectic approach follows the formations of what historians are now calling the Comanche Empire of 18th and 19th centuries. Like Pekka Hämäläinen, Finnish historian, says, Comanches became this imperial power whose aim was not to conquer and colonize, but to coexist, control, and exploit. And so in Bury the Hatchet, John follows his ancestral approach in creating, controlling, and remixing sounds of intracultural coexistence. You could take as another illustration the track Jimmy Creek, a Comanche story on the album, in which you've got a steel guitar, clarinet, and bass leading into this 1978 recording of John's grandfather, Johnny Reed, retelling a story he heard from Old Man Tahine, a Comanche elder back in 1926, about where precisely Comanches camped and how they would, quote, utilize everything from hunted buffalo. So the story stops and the instruments continue as the track moves into this old Kiowa powwow song recorded more recently in 1996. Or in the track Star House Satante song, Reed extends the narrative. As if he had just heard the story yesterday, Reed quotes Tohin talking of Comanche women as, quote, really smart, who countered then others' perceptions of them as just wild Indians. People say, and this is a quote, oh, they were just running around and all that. But women folks, he continues, were setting and tanning hides to make wonderful teepees, among many other tasks. So from Tohin, right, this goes from Tohin to Reed in the 1920s, Reed to Hitchcock in the late 1970s, John to his listeners in these pandemic times and into the future. This story travels through generations to set the record straight. The old stories, the old songs, right, as I wrap up here, they carry truth. They tell us who and where we come from. And now through John's Bury the Hatchet and its interwoven soundscapes and these old and new stories and sounds, they may go forth, right? They're not frozen in archives. They're not frozen in time. They may go forth to reach future generations, especially of Kiowas, Comanches, and so many other listeners. In John's recorded words of Cutnose, who's speaking in the voice of Lone Wolf, quote, we're people who roam about. We follow the animals. We camp where we feel is necessary. There's no boundaries. And so I remix this phrasing in the context of John's artistry. And that is, we create where we feel is necessary. We express, we educate, we challenge, we sing, and straight up, we rock out where we feel is necessary. There's no boundaries. So territorially, aesthetically, or musically, there's no boundaries, but there is, as Nancy was talking about earlier, this cultural responsibility to the land, to kinship, to songs, and to stories. Make peace, not boundaries. And so in closing and beginning, right, let's bury the hatchet, let's dig it up, let's remember, let's remix, and let's repeat. Thanks again to John for all the work that he's doing, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Dustin. That's beautiful. So, Jaleesa, let's maybe move out of the slide and move into John. John, I was just going to ask you for a quick response here, then we're going to go on over to Chris. But I loved the way Dustin was using the concept of refusal. And of course, most of us associate that with Audra Simpson and her scholarship around refusing. I wondered if you wanted to start there, or if you might just want to respond to something along the lines of how you can actually hear the piece Beads, Birds, and Bombs. I can hear that piece too. So any response you want to make to Dustin, that would be great.
I think the issue of the land and I'm like growing up off of Highway 49 on my family's land. Fort Sill's right across the street, basically, and we have witnessed the military personnel going up and down the dirt roads that are there, and then bombing from. And even at one point, my grandmother's land, the Fort Sill had used a section of that to bring the tanks in to shoot from that side over across, because it's the largest range to shoot weaponry. So growing up and like imagining those sounds you hear, and it's constant, and it's the house would shake, and our foundation had to be replaced. The Comanche tribe had to come in and work with contractors through Fort Sill, because the bombing had caused the whole foundation to shake and had to redo the whole front of the house. And so it's not uncommon for anyone who's grown up there or lived there to experience that sound. And then you go to the Wichita Mountains, it's beautiful birds and the buffalo, and then you go and you get permission to go on to Fort Sill to go and look at the range, and it's just such a unique experience to think about until you leave, and then you realize, whoa, what was that? What did I just grow up in? What does that mean?
Yeah, it's beautiful how you present this and all of the dimensions. I also just wanted to make sure folks know that there's a catalog with this exhibit, and that Dustin was reading from his essay. John, I don't know if you want to say something about the catalog, or Kathleen.
So the catalog's supposed to be coming out really soon, and I'm hoping like after this, it's going to be done. And yes, there will be a catalog, and we'll be able to put a link up for that on the website at the Portland Art Museum. And so there is some essays that are going to be a part of that, and pictures of the show and such, and the traveling of it.
So important that there's a record, so important. So for those of you who deal with words like me, the wordsmiths out there, and introducing Chris next as a speaker, Chris and I are working on an essay that's actually got the same title as today's programming, Oklahome, and this will be included in a volume with the University of Arizona Press titled Visualizing Genocide. I'm co-editing that with Yves Chavez, who's at UC Santa Cruz. So look out for that. The next couple of years, we're going to be revisiting John's work there. So Chris, let me invite you on. Where are you, Chris?
Glad to be here. Hello. I guess I'll go ahead and introduce myself. I'm Chris Aplin. I'm zooming in here today from lovely Pasadena, California, staring out my front window. I've got my violin here. My antiquated Edison cylinder is here. This is kind of always a fun part of these Zoom experiences. I've got my COVID era academic beard and shagginess. So it's good to be here with everybody today. People on this call are some very good and old friends, and so I'm glad to be here on this occasion. I've known John for a long time. I was the skinny 16-year-old kid showing up to his show at Night Tracks on Sheridan Boulevard in Lawton, Oklahoma, hoping that the doorman would think I looked 18 or wouldn't know how to add. So it's good to be sharing with everybody here right now.
You were in, you got in.
Sundowners, all ages.
Right, all age shows.
Yeah. But you know, it's really meaningful to be here because I also grew up in Southwest Oklahoma, and John's memories of the rattling windows I remember very well. You know, even his description of, you know, this thundering coming from Fort Sill and the beauty of the wildlife refuge just to the other side of the highway. I get that contrast. It also makes me a little nostalgic for being able to drive the back range at Fort Sill, because it used to be much more open. You could just even drive back through there, and even these hills that have been battered for, 100 and, 20, 30, 40 years by artillery, there is still kind of a beautiful calm to that space. And so it's interesting to be able to talk and hear everybody speaking about geography, the landscape of Southwest Oklahoma. I think when I think about what I do as an ethnomusicologist and as a writer, I try to think about how can we make Oklahoma matter to people, because most people do not know it. They have not engaged it. They can't see it or feel it. I think my big argument would be that John would be the perfect candidate because, as Dr. Mithlo said, it's a cumulative work, Bury the Hatchet. I've told John it's a Gesamtkunstwerk, which is like the German from Wagner. The integration of the visual, the music, the artistry and the sound, everything is tightly sort of integrated into one really dense project. And I think it's all here on this recording. But again, in kind of trying to communicate the relevance and meaning of Southwest Oklahoma to the world, how do you do it? Most people don't encounter it. And I'm here with my friends, and I think that one of the things that I find the most striking about it is that its history as a state only goes back 100 years. But if you want to know the place, you need to know the tribes. And we talk here, I think that John's Bury the Hatchet gives a lot of information about geographies. I think Cutthroat Gap is a Kiowa geography. I think that a lot of, there's some discussion of Rainy Mountain. That's kind of more of an internal Oklahoma thing, more of a Kiowa landscape, whereas Fort Sill and south towards the Red River are kind of more Comanche. And I think it's really important for people to understand the difference between these tribes, and most people don't. How do they encounter it? And just to take a minute, it's not just Kiowas and Comanches in Southwest Oklahoma. It's Kiowas, Comanches, Apaches, KCAs, WCDs, Wichitas, Caddos, and Delawares, and then Cheyennes and Arapahoes. this is a world people do not know. And it's remarkable to be able to see it in image and color and vibrance and generosity in John's work. But I think it's important for people to kind of grapple a little bit with what that world means. And so to ask John a little bit, he is Kiowa and he's Comanche. These are two very different people. Is there any way that you can describe the contrast between your Kiowa heritage or background or memory or those landscapes as they show up in Bury the Hatchet? Is there any way you can address that for us?
Yeah, I guess it's because growing up, my grandfather was Kiowa. He's a descendant of St. Daide, and grandma's Comanche, and she's from the Isarosa people. And so they both spoke fluent Comanche and Kiowa, and they both could speak some of each other's language. And so we grew up with that as kids. And I, like I said earlier, I think we were talking before, but sitting around a fire and my grandparents tending to this, and my aunts and everyone there, and then the elders were all speaking in their languages, and then going to the Indian hospital, the IHS in Lawton, you would sit in the waiting room, and all the kakus, the grandmothers, would be sitting there, and they'd just be going, and then you hear a word, and you're like, ooh, you understand it because I would hear that language at home, grandparents, but then when you hear that at the hospital, you start to get this idea of this crossover. And then even talking with grandma and like, how did you learn? Why are you, when she was asking me to draw flowers, she's like, go outside and draw roses. I'm like, well, why? I didn't go, Grandma, why do I draw roses? But it taught me how to look at roses and understand the idea of observation. But on the other end, she was actually really into floral patterns because she was in boarding school in Enidarko at Riverside. And so at that boarding school, that experience of her experience other tribes from up north where I'm living now and in Wisconsin, and the tribal people here that were down there, and them having these conversations by the river and sharing knowledge, like that is amazing. And then on the other end, it continues to happen. And that's what we do as people. And the stories that, like, for instance, Jason recorded, like, I know we have talked about this, like keeping track of things and recording. I've always had 4-track recorders and mixing devices since I was 15. So I was always recording stories. And I recorded my grandparents singing hymnal and Comanche and Kiowa songs in the 90s when I left after college, and keeping those recordings. I wanted to have a way to kind of keep track of who I am, where I'm from, and have a direction to follow, and also have those as a grounding to go and look at so that I can think about it. And so when I go home, I do the same, like Jason, hanging out with him. He passed away a few years ago, but going back, and we'd be riding him around, and he lived really close to Cutthroat Gap. Like the name. Yeah.
Right. Jason particularly felt like he had it's interesting, even in the region, this is a very small region of land, but it felt a little bit like his stories all had a Kiowa compass to them a little bit.
Well, he's Kiowa, and so in Arapaho, Cheyenne, Arapaho and Kiowa, but his Kiowa's area, his family, and they live right there, and his house is right close to Cutthroat Gap. And
yeah,
mountain, I mean, we've driven there many times, and Saddle Mountain is right around not far from there. It's where my grandparents are buried there. And then it's when I go home, I would go and see them and visit, and along the way, I'd take my iPhone. I'd always have it. I'd say, hey, is it cool? Hey, Heights, all right? And he's like, yeah, man, go for it. And he loves to tell a story, so I would record him.
Yeah, it's interesting too, the intimacy of that recording, because you feel like you are. Did you record that in a car? You were just riding around?
I was driving, and Jason's like, hey, let's go to town. He goes, hey, let's go over here by Cutthroat Gap. There's a spot to visit. So on the way we're driving, we crossed Jimmy Creek, and And he's like, hey, stop for a second. And he tells me the story, and his voice just shifts, and it's just, whoa, it's just really
Right.
deep, and you hear it. And I was like, I'm glad I was recording, because this moment, it's one of those intimate moments that you don't get every day, because it was a real situation that happened, and it was on tape.
Right. That's one of the things that strikes me about Native community recordings, is they are so intimate. But I felt like I was a stupid kid in the back seat driving around with you guys going, are they talking about this? You know, it's like there's a real sense of that. I think in the recording, and I think that there is a sense too that you're really invested in it. So, I mean, these are very personal sort of things. Your grandfather's recordings too, you know, it kind of speaking and instructing in that way, you know, bringing up his memories like that. I mean, that really is a very intimate experience to share. And I think it's one of the important things about the work. You know, you were talking a little bit earlier, you know, about all those people that converged at Riverside Indian School, you know, for the people from up in Wisconsin, you know, all the different tribes in the region around Anadarko. I've described this as the cosmopolitan Indian world, you know. It's a dynamic place filled with many, many different languages. I guess I just wanted to ask you, because you being a traveler, you being cosmopolitan and going and doing exhibits in Venice, I think you maybe did Germany, you've kind of been all over. Do you feel like audiences the world over have an ability to understand Southwest Oklahoma and Oklahoma and what it means?
I think that's a heavy question, because the first time I actually traveled international, I mean, I never had to meet, other than going, you know, to Mexico and Texas, Oklahoma was a given from living in the region, and it's still, to me, it's kind of a part of the same area. So, but my first trip was having this position in Madison, and it was in 2003, I think, and I got an opportunity to go to South Africa, and printmaking, the media that I used has all these conferences, and there's this international conference called Impact. And so I went to South Africa to present, and that was my first real trip, and it was to Cape Town. And I remember landing, and I'm in this, at the time, a big tanker boat had basically got stuck into the Cape Town area, and everybody was really upset, and they were upset about Bush and all the politics, and my work at the time was about that stuff. So I'm there, and I remember listening and then looking at the landscape, and I looked over and I saw these little mountains, and I'm like, well, that looks like the Wichita Mountains. That's cool. And I was like waiting for you know, buffalo, and then all of a sudden a zebra runs by. I'm like, wow.
That's a mind bender.
Wow. That is mind blowing. And then I meet Roderick Souls, who's an artist, printmaker, but grew up in the region. And he talked about the racial difference. And Edgar Heapabirds, a colleague and mentor, said, meet him because he will show you the way, like what's going on there. And we ended up going out to a township, and it was magic. It was just like going home, because the people I met were of different cultural backgrounds, different situations, uniquely speaking different languages. And I'm like, wow, this is exactly, you know, and then the differences too of not being fully one or the other. And so the questions of politics were like, oh, hey, let's talk. And so the conversations were rich, and it was amazing. That was my first international trip, and it just changed me after that.
Yeah, you traveled from home to another world that just sounds like your home, a variety and mix of people with a similar landscape and remarkable wildlife. You're a true citizen and cosmopolitan of the world.
Yeah, it was.
You know, I'm trying to think. There's a lot of use of language too, I think, in your recording. Not just in the English language. I think actually some of the most meaningful are the recordings that I've run across in the traditional language, in traditional languages, and particularly you have a Comanche Prayer on there, and it's a language is such a meaningful thing. There's a anthropologist, Mark Raymond Harrington, that's kind of a common thing that I go back to. He went back to a fire dance held at Fort Sill while the Apache prisoners of war were there in about sometime between 1909 and 1911. And he started describing the scene in one of his articles that he wrote. And he was trying to describe what was going on. And he said, "They're among the sheeted visitors," which is to say that they were Plains territory, among like Plains Indians, you know, the blanket Indians. They're among the sheeted visitors. You could hear the sing-song drawling tones of the Kiowa language, the matter-of-fact sounds of the Comanche language, and the Apache language, which has the most complex phonetics that I've ever heard. So, I mean, to me, that's just like it seemed like beat poetry when I first read it, because it was just kind of so poetic in the way that it described the diversity and range of people there, you know. But I bring that up because, you know, like the Comanche Prayer on your album, languages mean a lot for people in Southwest Oklahoma. And maybe you could just take a moment and talk a little bit about what it meant for you incorporating that use of language, that use of Comanche language, or even your knowledge of Kiowa language and its use in Southwest Oklahoma.
Well, the Comanche Prayer was actually Juanita Pataponi, who we lost recently. She was actually my high school art teacher too at Elgin, and she started the Comanche Nation College, and very important, respected elder to the community. And Juanita, talked with her about like, is there, you know, a prayer in you know, Comanche? And she actually recorded this prayer and on the iPhone and sent that to me to be able to use. And so it was empowering, and it was originally for a blessing for a marriage, and also for the idea of blessing. And so one of the unique things in it, when I listened to it, I was thinking in learning it too, and it was difficult to think about words and like even the word God. You hear God in that prayer, and I think like Grandpa would say Daki, like for Kiowa and Comanche, you know, it's just the difference in language and thinking. And then, like you said, the collision of people, or someone had mentioned that, like differences in people, and hearing my grandmother speak to my grandfather, there was differences. And so asking for something important like that was always hard for someone from my background, in the sense of asking elders, hey, can I you know, can you help me out here? You kind of just sort of wait until it's your time to get it. And so when talking to Juanita was always very open and understanding, and say, hey, you should think about this, you should try this, you should. And so the communications with her have over time, like, you know, since I was a kid, it's just been empowering. And I think weirdly, to go from my grandmother was originally who I go to ask the questions to, and then Juanita was the next, you know, elder. Mm-hmm. And my Marty, who is Comanche, and a family member too. She's the youngest now, like, that I can reach out to, and you know, we Instagram and text each other. So if I, you know, to find out how and what and such, as part of the Comanche language program. So I think there's a beauty in the reality of younger people being involved, and in the shifting of that, and then also the language program and its existence, and mm-hmm. that still happening, and it's alive. It's, you know, it's happening now. It's a spoken language.
Well, it's so important, John, that you're documenting all of these. And I like to think that things happen in the way that they are supposed to happen. And of course, we couldn't have imagined we would lose our beloved auntie. But, you know, I think John, for those of you on the call, is planning to share something at the end of this conversation. So hold on for that, because we'll be hearing that prayer actually later on. I'm going to just kind of shift a little bit here, guys, and let everyone know that we're going to open up for audience questions. There's a lot of you on the line. And if you could just go ahead and pop those into the Q&A, and Jaleesa's going to help me go through some of those. Just to remind everyone, we probably won't get to everyone's question. If we don't get to your question, our apologies. We're all folks that are kind of out there circulating in the world. So if there's a burning issue, I'm sure you could direct it to Kathleen, and she could direct it to us. And we'd love to continue the conversation. So there's a lot out there already. We've got John's exhibit, all the resources online, the album, the upcoming catalog, and then the book that Chris and I are working for an essay on. So there'll be more resources forthcoming. So let me just segue over here and see, Jaleesa, if you're on, if you've got an open question. If one hasn't come through yet, then I'm going to ask a question.
We do not currently have any questions yet.
Oh, shy crowd, or maybe it's just Sunday afternoon and we've just feeling a little lazy. Let me follow through on something that Dustin had said, and I think, Chris, this also has relevance for you. And this is this idea of learning to listen and listening to learn. So we've talked a lot about language, about how culture is being captured, reproduced, recirculated, constantly on the go, moving, we're refusing to stop. Can you talk a little bit more about this idea of silence, and silence actually maybe being generative, and how do we learn that we need to just pause and listen? Because I know I get a lot of students that are awkward about asking and not knowing when and how. So John, if you want to start, and then maybe Chris and Dustin, if you want to move in there.
That it becomes, I think, harder to listen as I get older, because I spent so much time listening as a kid and not speaking, and then over time of teaching and demands and not interrupting for so long, like not interrupting because you're not supposed to. And I think there's an understanding of finding a sense of ownership of eldership. And I think that for a lot of people, as you get older, in particular for me, coming from the community I come from, you never wanted to, claim, oh, I'm an elder. No, you earn that, you live a life and you become that. And I think that once that happens, then you have to listen to yourself to understand how to be a better elder, because the elders that shaped the way and held you to get there, some of them are gone now. So they're not in this world, they're in a different space. So how are we listening to what's not heard, what's out there, that they're still here, but how do we get that information, and how do we silence ourselves? Because now we've taken this ownership over eldership. And I think that that's where I'm at now, going, okay, there's a time to cease. And I think it's hard because of our field and teaching and academia and working with so many people and seeing so much over time and being further removed from certain places. I thought we were frozen for a second. I thought I was just going on and on. I'm taking a pause.
No, we're live. We're live again. Looks like Chris is going to jump in.
Glasses, what my grandmother would say, it's tequas.
There's so much to think about, and it's so hard to focus your questions or your statements, in a setting like this, because there's so much that I want to say. But there was I actually did a presentation at Comanche Nation College with the help of Juanita Pataponi, and she invited me in. I was able to give a lecture, and I remember raising a historical work about Comanche folks. And I remember she said that she had met the author like at a conference or something like that. And she was like, she had said, "You didn't even come and talk to us." And his answer was, "I didn't know I had to." And that's not really in a historian's toolkit. That's not what they're expected to do. They deal with books, they deal with text, they deal with documents at the National Archive, But I'd say that one of the things that have been the most valuable for me was trying to learn how to listen and to not take notes. Don't take video, keep your ears open and try to keep your mind open and record and understand what you see. And that knowledge will come later. I think that there's something that I think is everybody could learn a little bit of something like that. Listening more, maybe not even speak and hold on to it and, wait for the knowledge to come to you. So, even at this age, being a kid or a non-elder, still listening, opening up your ears and kind of being a part of that process of just letting it come in, I think is important. But that's just kind of what I wanted to add, because I think that a lot of historians would be better served speaking with Native people. There are much more dynamic histories to be written. I see a lot of that dynamic history in your sounds and in your artwork and in the writings that you've shared with us as we put this together. So I also wanted to thank you for that.
And there's so many, just to briefly add on to what y'all are saying. It's very common, for folks not to talk with us, to go forth and build their careers off of Native peoples, Native lands, and and to not do that work. And it's I think of part of the American Indian movement soundtrack in the 1960s, that Floyd Red Crow Westerman was putting out there. One of his tracks, they didn't listen, and the they was to the boarding school teachers, to the colonizers, just not listening. And it's also it's really rich when we start putting these terms into our own respective traditional languages. In the Namatequap, when you go through our latest edition of an all Comanche authored dictionary, this one here, there are scores of terms that are just so focused on listening, on types of listening to this or hearing that sound, and it's so reflective of our very complex and beautiful people with having such a beautiful language. We have a term like nakara for just hearing, but then tavitsi nakara, just this closely listening, like critical, creative listening modes, right? And I think part of what is challenging, and yet we keep going forth with it, is when we're listening and then trying to communicate that back, it can be really ineffable of trying to fully articulate it, because I think so much of it is it's affect. Affect, often gets written off as just being synonymous with emotion, but affect, the way I understand it, is affect is something much deeper. It's what is deep within that allows us to even have emotions, right? And so when we go into affective listening, right, I think it can make a lot of sense that, we may not be able to fully articulate it, we may not even fully comprehend it, but we go forth, and try to build these archives and keep trying to share what could be publicly shareable, or maybe shareable just among certain folks, among certain relatives, and going forth like that the best we can.
Yeah, I could talk all day about the archive. I've got a lot of students working on that. It's a hot topic right now. So thank you. Thank you, Dustin and Chris. We've got a question from Emily, and thanks for tuning in, Emily. The question is, I'm wondering if you could each speak about your unique understanding of the bugle and or taps as used in the album and works on paper. So specifically to the album and works on paper, John, that would be you. I would start with you, but I'll just say, in terms of my experience as being a Fort Sill Chiricahua tribal member, it's a surprise to some folks, but we can be buried on the base, and I go to funerals at Fort Sill where they will come and play taps for us. That could happen in the future. That has happened throughout my life. And so it's, to me, just a very embodied part of our traditions now. It's become kind of normalized. I know that sounds surprising. I don't even think too deeply through it. It's just part of what happens now. But John, it looks like Emily's asking specifically about the music and the works on paper. So I'll pass to you, and then hopefully we'll have a minute for Chris and for Dustin.
I think I've maybe have talked about this with Chris before too, and about the bugle and its importance to St. Dide's people, St. Dide's, the descendancy of St. Dide, and St. Dide was known for taking a bugle from the cavalry, and then like actually at the Geronimo Guard Cell house in Fort Sill, there's the bugle is actually there. I remember seeing it as a kid, and I asked my grandfather about it, and he kind of was like, "You'll find out someday. Like, I'll tell you." Back to that moment of you don't ask, you just listen, and you'll find out when it's time. And so the bugle it was taken, but also reused in a sense of appropriated. It's sort of like mixing culture. Like, I'm going to take this section and then I'm going to come back at you. So when the Kiowa came into warfare, they would use the St. Dide in particular would use the bugle as a form of call out, like, hey, we're, come on, we're here. This is here's a time and here's the moment, and we're on the battlefield. And then on the other end of it, I'm listening to the idea of the honoring of what that bugle means in those songs. And so I think of the Kiowa flag song and those notes. And I remember sitting with swelling on my guitar and hearing that dun, 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 dun. And I was like, hey, that sounds like taps. And then I started to realize those cadences and the use of the bugle, which does not have the little, I don't know what they're called. Chris will help me here. The little three. Yeah, those things.
The valves.
Valves, thank you. You have to use your mouth armature and to make this happen. So those sounds, and I think the cadences of tribal songs, in particular Kiowa songs, and how that functions and the use of that. But on the other end, I think of the conflict of the complex power dynamics of war and voyeurism and service, and like the service to the military and service to the land and the service to Fort Sill and the Native people who have served in this place and also fought overseas for wars for the land and for their people. And then also the idea of you go in the Kiowa flag song is equal to taps for the Kiowa people. And so you hear it and there's a reverence of like, that's a special sacred moment to honor our veterans, honor our people, honor all these elders who have stood there and fought for our rights and for our people. So when I hear that sound, I think of like St. Dide and all that has happened from our descendancy that we're at now, and that placement, displacement, and space that we're in, and then rethinking it through the sounds. And then that goes back to what Dustin's talked about, the sounds of that war. Like it's constant because the sounds of Fort Sill are still roaring on. The war hasn't ended. The bombs are still dropping.
Dustin, do you want to jump in with that, or?
Yeah, I'm just listening to John there. Yeah, and it's reminding me, much of that of just this history of Comanches, Kiowas, and other Native peoples. But I'm especially thinking of Comanches and things that I've heard from Auntie Juanita Pataponi, just Comanches, always just finding the resources that we need, right? People ask, what did y'all do specifically? What was the paint that you used? How did you do this and that? And it's just, there's just such a long history of warfare, of trading and raiding and diplomacy, and all these ways that it plays out and continues, and to where we can, there's a model in so many ways of learning, from what I call like the ancestral acoustics, right? Of how to really listen to the old ancestral sounds, how to do that in really critical and creative ways nowadays. And it's being exemplified right here with Bury the Hatchet and with what John is speaking on.
Okay, I think we've got time, Chris, for you to go ahead and respond, because I know this is.
I'll try to keep it quick because this next question I think is pretty interesting. But The bugle and taps, it reminds me of driving around on Fort Sill with my father at the end of the day and pulling over and putting my hand over my heart while my father saluted the flag as they played it and took down the flag. So it's a very common thing around Fort Sill. I think it's also, in a lot of ways, a very Indian thing, a very Southwest Oklahoma thing. John brings up Satayade. My understanding was that he actually confused the other side by blowing contrary, commands, because it's a signaler in war at one point. So they had specific acts, for charge, so if the U.S. general says charge, he's over there playing retreat, presumably, it's like, so there's a creative insubordination there that's great to think about too. It's also Sam Houses himself was a bugler too. So, I mean, that martial history that's very prominent in many Native communities in Southwest Oklahoma. I think all that stuff is meaningful. I think actually the image of the bugle itself is the most iconic image of the Bury the Hatchet project and experience. It speaks very strongly as a simple image. It has multiple meanings, and that's part of the reason that I like it.
Well, we've gotten to the part, thank you, Chris. We've gotten to the part now of our program where we're going to have to close out. And I hate to be the one to have to do this, but we've gone a little bit over. We've got questions we did not get to, and apologies to those of you who had a question. Feel free to go ahead and maybe be in touch with the Portland Art Museum if you want one of us specifically to answer that question. I understand, John, that you've got a segment now that you would like to close with. And so just on behalf of everyone, thank you for this wonderful gift of time. And I'll let John take it from here.
Actually, I'll just jump in really quick with a few words. I wanted to thank our panelists, John, Nancy, Dustin, and Chris, for all making this such an interesting and special discussion. Thanks to the Portland Art Museum, especially Stephanie Parrish and Jaleesa Johnson for supporting this program. Bury the Hatchet will be traveling next to the Madison Museum of Contemporary Art. So let me pass it back to John for a closing video.
Anansuakai namigad, siku tavanit, namisutai, namihanitui, ura.